Let's get some deeper analysis now and talk to Keir Giles, who's a senior consulting fellow of the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House. He's also author of Moscow Rules: What Drives Russia to Confront the West. Keir, thanks ever so much for coming on the programme. Look, there's been a huge international effort to support Ukraine's resistance, a financial declaration of war, if you like. What, or is there even a way out now for Putin?
Well, President Putin has said very clearly that he only sees one way out of that, and that, in effect, is all of his war aims for Ukraine. And let's not forget what those aims are. It is, in effect, the erasure of Ukraine from the map and the elimination of Ukrainians as a separate people. In other words, Putin wants to bend reality to meet his fantasy of how the former Soviet space has actually been divided up. So there is very little scope for negotiation. If Ukraine wants to continue to exist as a country, it has to continue fighting this war.
Well, it sounds like capitulation not an option in your view. In terms of the sanctions being imposed on Moscow, what will the long-term impact of Russia's isolation be?
Well, there's already been devastation to the Russian economy and a huge impact on the lives of ordinary Russians. But of course, we don't know exactly what most of those Russians are blaming this impact on. They've been fed a diet of Russian state propaganda for so long, and Russia has worked so hard to cut them off from information about what's happening in the outside world, that many of them may well believe that this is an unprovoked assault by the West that has no relation to Russia's state behavior. Now, Russia has also prepared itself over the long term for managing public discontent, for managing protests not only about the course of the war and Russia launching the war in the first place, but also if the standard of living there continues to deteriorate. Russia has set up a massive internal security force equipped with heavy weapons for dealing with mass demonstrations on the streets in the most brutal way possible. So in so many ways, Putin has been leading up to this moment for 20 years and has made himself as prepared as he possibly can be.
So what do you envisage could be, what Germany calls Zeitenwende, the turning point?
Well, that is, in fact, the most spectacular turning around of what we've seen over the last 2 weeks. The Russian invasion was less of a surprise than this amazing transformation in German policy and dragging the EU behind it. After so many decades finally awakening to the threat from Russia, realizing the challenge that Moscow poses to security in Europe, and actually recognizing that you need to do something about it. And the other states beyond Ukraine need now to look to their defenses because they are the next targets for Moscow.
So in terms of Western government's response, how much further can they go?
I think we're going to see increasing, not decreasing, pressure for measures like no-fly zones, however impractical they may be and however dangerous they may be. We'll see calls for more weaponry, like this apparently highly impractical suggestion for supplying Ukraine with former Soviet fighter aircraft that are operated by its neighbors. The pressure will just grow, especially as Russia follows its tactic of engineering humanitarian catastrophes within Ukraine in order to try to pressurize Kiev into surrendering. That situation is only going to get worse, so the calls for direct intervention by other powers are going to get louder. The problem is when that moment comes, as we've heard explained very clearly from the United States and other countries over the last week, that in effect is little short of a declaration of war on Russia in order to protect those innocent people in between.
It's been 2 weeks so far. People are talking about months, maybe years, maybe even decades. Policymakers like the UK's Liz Truss have gone on record saying that the cost of living crisis is going to be worsened by this conflict. Higher petrol prices, energy bills, etc. for consumers. But that's incomparable to the alternative, which would not be holding Putin to account. But the longer this goes on, the more that resolve is going to be tested in the UK and Germany and France all over.
Well, that's absolutely right. And why is it being tested now? It's because that investment in containing Russia was not made previously, because European countries were not willing to look to their own defenses and now have to pay the cost because they were so dependent on energy and other economic interaction with Russia, not realizing just how that set up a trap for their own future economic well-being. All of those chickens are now coming home to roost. All of those mistakes that have been made and were clearly called out at the time are now coming back to bite Western economies. Yes, it is going to be painful, and yes, it is going to be expensive, but it is far less expensive than allowing President Putin to undertake his aggressive intentions further across Europe.
Keir Giles, absolute pleasure talking to you. Keir Giles from Chatham House, thank you.
Yeah.